Welcome to the Recover You podcast. I'm Kylene.
And I'm Patrick.
We are a couple in recovery
From sex addiction
and betrayal trauma. Together we share our story to encourage you on your journey. It's here that we talk about sex addiction, betrayal trauma, mental, emotional, and physical health, faith, and anything and everything needed to recover you to your most authentic self that God created you to be. Welcome to another episode of Recover You. Patrick is here today.
I'm here and I feel great.
Lies from the devil. Hey, last week's episode was about lies, Patrick. You can't be lying here. How you feeling?
I'm here today.
Surviving might be a strong
That's
word.
Right. Making it happen. Making it happen.
No, you are on the upswing. You are on the upswing. This is just so everybody listening doesn't think you've been sick for an entire month by the time these episodes come out. This is day 10.
Mm-hmm.
Is that right?
Yeah.
And you've been on antibiotics for 2 or 3 days now?
3 days.
3 days?
Yeah.
So starting to feel a little bit better.
Yeah. It's, I haven't been this sick this long.
Yeah.
In a long, long time. So,
I don't think I've ever seen you get sick for this long. It's been tough. There's been a lot of sleeping happening.
Yeah, which is actually really nice, but it'd be nice to be able to do other things.
For you being a manifesting generator, the idea of doing nothing and just relaxing.
Oh, it's driving me crazy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I'm like, hey, welcome to my life. Just chill.
I actually had a feeling this morning.
You don't have to do anything.
Yeah.
If you don't want to.
I actually had a feeling this morning that I should just get up and run and like blow out my lungs and stuff like that and hack it up and everything like that. So that's how I feel.
No.
So.
Well, thank you for being here today.
Yes.
This is an important topic to have you here, to have your perspective and everything. Today, we're talking about sex after recovery. So, this episode and next week's episode, we are going to be as, what's the word I want to use? PG as possible, while also not beating around the bush. Usually this is a pretty clean podcast in terms of how we talk about it, even though we're talking about sex addiction and everything. So if there is any chance that you are listening to this episode, with kids in the car or something, this episode and next week's episode may be a little bit not appropriate. Again, we're gonna try to use terminology that's very clear when we're talking about this, while also hopefully not being triggering or offensive in any way. And so I will say, if hearing about certain things around this topic might be triggering for the phase that you're in recovery, whether you're the addict or the betrayed partner, just be aware of that. Be aware of what your personal boundaries in this area are. And if this is not the episode for you, that's okay. But I think for a lot of people, this episode and next week's episode may be really helpful because, again, sort of like the topic in general, sex addiction, porn addiction, betrayal trauma, like these aren't things that people talk about out loud. And today we're going to be talking about sex after recovery, sex after betrayal, right? And if people don't talk about betrayal out loud, they certainly aren't talking about having sex with your partner after betrayal and all of the ins and outs of that. And so just sex in general, people don't talk about. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say as you're making the intro here, there's so many minefields around sex, even in a just the way we're raised, and we're not equipped, and then you throw in addiction and betrayal and
twisting
in everyone's own
healthiness of it,
right, and everybody's own insecurities and fears, and it's so incredibly complicated. But the design was for it to be beautiful and connecting. And so what's interesting is how far we move away from what is the God honoring way to practice, sex, and how hard it is to come back to that with all the woundedness that comes from, through our lives and through the decades of our lives, and how, and I think is for those of you who are listening to this, much like it doesn't take, overnight to become a sex addict. You don't, snap your fingers and you're a sex addict, nor do you get over betrayal very quickly. Sex is that way too. It's got to be something that's talked about and practiced well, and brought alongside of some clearer principles like safety and healthy desire. And there's just so much that goes into it. So don't feel
I
like,
think there's so many questions around that
right,
after betrayal and addiction, right? I think people are like, but I want to have sex after, but now it's been tainted and now I'm uncomfortable. And what
right,
is healthy? What's not healthy? Okay, but
yeah,
if I'm having intercourse, does that mean everything's okay now? Like all of these different things, but you might feel super disconnected with your partner, even if you're having intercourse. So it's just, we want to talk about how to make it as healthy as possible. And so we're going to split this actually into 2 episodes. And I think your point is really good of like, once we have experienced or been hurt by the twisting of sexuality in our lives, it does take intentional effort to untwist it and to get back to the goodness of it. And that for us has been very difficult. I think on both sides. I think maybe primarily on my side, but I think for both of us, it's been a journey. And we're going to talk a little more specifically about our personal journey and some details there in the next episode. But for this episode, we're focusing a lot on sort of just reestablishing or thoughts and questions, I guess, around sex after recovery and after betrayal for the first 6 months to a year. And so we're going to talk about some practical stuff. We're going to talk about some of the fears there. But as you were talking, I'm thinking, yeah, this is just important to talk about, kind of like anything that we've talked about in previous episodes. When you bring it into the light, it's less scary.
mhm,
Whenever we choose topics in life or culture or family or whatever, or religion or anything, anytime we choose these little topics to be quote unquote taboo topics, oh, you're not allowed to ask about that. Oh, you're not allowed to talk about that. Oh, you're not allowed to use this word. It piques people's curiosity and or it makes people feel ashamed about that topic, even when it's not a topic that you should feel shame about. And so there's just a lot around sex. There's a lot around our bodies. There's a lot around connecting to other humans that we don't talk about, because a lot of times I think culture promotes this idea, like throughout all of history, right? That if you have intercourse, that's the end goal. You've done it, right? But it misses this depth that's just like one layer of it, and it really misses this depth of so many other traits and qualities that go into making that a really wonderful experience, because you can have sex and it's truly just a physical thing, where you can have sex in a way that is this culmination, this expression of a lot of intentionality, a lot of connection, a lot of vulnerability, a lot of safety. And then that really takes it from a place of physicality to an action that encompasses physical, emotional, and spiritual connection. And so I think it's just a totally different thing. And I know growing up in, sort of conservative evangelical culture, oh my gosh, I had purity culture. I was raised in that, and that was not great. It did not help. And I think I've sort of carried with me a lot of wounding around this area in particular. And then, of course, going through betrayal just exponentially sort of exploded that for me. I remember listening to an episode of, there's a couple, I think on social media, they're called the yoga couple or yogi couple or something like that. And they wrote a book called The Inner Work. And it's really great because it talks about kind of the things that I do with my clients and a lot of the same sort of perspectives of, limiting beliefs and, how we can overcome that and change the way we think and how we live. But they have a real like spiritual focus to everything. Right. And I remember listening to one of their podcast episodes, and it was about sexuality and intimacy. And the way they described it to me was, oh my gosh, like that's what I want. That is what I want. And I remember also reading a book that sort of talked about sex in this way as well. And it was really talking about it in a way that it's a spiritual experience. And when I have historically had so many different inputs in my life that have sort of communicated to me that it's negative, that it's shameful, that it's physical, that it's hurtful, that it's a power over thing, that it's selfish, or that it's bad, or whatever it is, right? Or there's just a physical experience or whatever. It just makes you not want to do it, right? And then the pain that you've experienced with different things, it's like, well, man, like why, like who's interested in that? It's hurtful, right? But the way these other people have described it, I think that is kind of a little bit what we want to impart on this episode. So over this episode and next episode, I hope that we communicate that a little bit, that we don't just believe that the only thing that sex is a physical interaction. And I think sometimes when we come with that assumption, that actually leads us into a lot of the pathways and a lot of the belief systems and a lot of fears and a lot of the woundings that can contribute to negative patterns of sexual behavior. Well, it's just physical, and it's a need, which I addressed in the last episode. It's not a need, it's a desire in a healthy context and a healthy relationship, right? And so it can get just so twisted. So today we're going to talk about, gosh, what does this look like as you're going through recovery? We're going to talk about some kind of practical stuff, but also some things some thoughts, some fears people have around it, after betrayal has happened, after addiction. And so again, just reiterating, this is like sort of early on. Next week, we're going to talk more about sort of establishing the intimacy between a couple and the slow, intentional process that you can take to do that with intentionality. So let's start with after discovery or after disclosure, whichever was your story or both, some fears from the person who has been betrayed that can come up around sex. So, or some thoughts and feelings around this. One is, I want to feel wanted, right? So there's a lot that comes up for the betrayed partner that is kind of around the idea of, well, you clearly wanted to interact with other human beings, with other bodies, with other sexual activities, whatever it was, whether it's anywhere on the spectrum from porn to cybersex to prostitutes, right? Like there's something there that we interpret as a betrayed partner that you wanted something other than me. And so one of the things that we really want after discovery is to feel wanted. Another one is, at the same time that you want to feel wanted, you might have this intense desire to protect yourself, right? Because while you're having these desires to be looked at and desired by your partner, you're also going, can I even trust this person? So there's oftentimes a big push-pull where there's I want you to want me, and also I want to have the ability to say no here and to set some boundaries. Very often it can go either direction. And so people ask about sexuality after betrayal because they go, well, I don't want to have it at all, or I want to have it a lot. Is that normal? And so my answer to both of those would be, it's very common to have both of those responses. So hypersexuality is a lot of times when someone has been betrayed and all of a sudden they sort of subconsciously go, well, I'll fulfill that for you. And I want to feel wanted and desired as well. And so I'm going to have all the sex with you. I'm going to become hypersexual for a period of time. And sometimes people don't even really understand immediately why that's happening. It's just a subconscious response that they have to the betrayal. And a lot of times that is, again, trying to feel wanted, trying to feel loved. And there's not necessarily a quote unquote right or wrong here. So let's kind of preface this as we're talking about a lot of these things. What we ultimately want to sort of help you do is, over the long term, establish like a really, really healthy relationship with a really, really healthy sexual relationship as part of that. But through this process, I would say probably all of us are going to engage in experiences through recovery that it's not necessarily like this perfect line of recovery, right? We are all going to have wounds from it. We're all going to have pain from it. We're all going to make decisions out of fear or anger or sadness or whatever periodically. And there's not necessarily a right or wrong there, but I want to sort of help you make sense of why some of these things are happening and what we have to look forward to if we continue moving through the recovery process. So a lot of times people will have the hypersexuality response, but they can also have the hyposexuality response where it's like, don't touch me. I have a lot of modesty boundaries. This was much more the end of the spectrum that I went, where I was like, I need to be in control of every aspect of the modesty. I need to be in control of every aspect of if we do anything, what we're doing, how much we're doing, how much you can see or not see, that sort of thing, because I had a lot of boundaries around that for a lot of reasons. And that's another thing to sort of speak into here. When someone has a reaction of hyper or hyposexuality after betrayal, there are so many reasons, again, not right or wrong necessarily, but just sort of understanding where do you come from? What are your patterns in your history? What trauma history have you had? What negative or positive experiences have you had with sex in the past? Because if you've had negative beliefs about your body, if you've had negative sexual experiences, if you've had any sort of abuse or any sort of trauma around sex or sexuality or your body or anything like that, that is all going to play into this response after betrayal. Because again, betrayal just highlights any insecurity you have and brings it right up to the surface and kind of reminds you and goes, see, that insecurity is real. This is true. You should be afraid of this, etc. So it is common for people to go either end of the spectrum. So just sort of be aware of that. And if you're wanting something other than what you're experiencing, then keep listening, because again, next week we are really going to talk about how to connect to your partner in different ways and deeper ways. So some other thoughts that the betrayed partner can have are thoughts like, well, he's an addict, so should I just replace his addiction? I'm going to go do a boudoir shoot. I'm going to get new lingerie. I'm going to, again, become hypersexual. I'm going to say yes to anything that he wants, maybe even things that I'm uncomfortable with, or I'm going to ask him what he was into, and I'm going to try to fulfill that. And so we just really want to be careful with that, because as you are moving towards recovery with your partner, you do not want to treat yourself with the same objectivity that addiction treats other human beings with. So you are more than an object. You are a valuable partner in a relationship. And we want to reinfuse humanity and compassion, empathy into the sexual relationship.
Yeah, and we've said this before, but some of the betrayed may get this advice from various organizations, family members, whatever, to go ahead and almost, be more promiscuous with your partner. And maybe that's a wrong word, but like wear lingerie or whatever. Just be very careful that there's a whole school of thought that almost feels like, well, yeah, just become his new pornography. And it's a very demeaning, I guess,
it's disrespectful and demeaning. That's a really good word for it. Yeah. And you're so much more than that. And the thing is, when you have that type of approach to it, it's completely disrespectful to the autonomy and the humanity of the betrayed partner herself. Because then, what if you're not comfortable with something? Right. And it also skips right over the negative patterns that the addict has already demonstrated. He needs to heal that first before creating intimacy and connection with his partner. You don't just take the negative patterns and then choose to lay them over your current relationship, because while in some instances that might feel exciting, or it might feel good for a couple weeks or a couple months or whatever, over time it's not solving the problem, and it's not helping you grow closer, and it's not being respectful of the betrayed partner. It's not respectful of their needs, their safety, their desires, that sort of thing. Some other thoughts that the betrayed partner can have are, how do I know he's really attracted to me, right? There's a fear, one of the biggest fears, the most common fears after betrayal is the comparison between the pictures, the videos, the women, the affair partners, whoever it was, whatever it was, if it was real life or if it was social media or if it was photoshopped or any of those things, or cinematic or whatever. There's a lot of pain for the betrayed partner, and so naturally, either immediately or sometimes over time, this fear of comparison and this insecurity in their own sexuality and their own ability to show up in the relationship in a way that's attractive and in their body, or how they can, quote unquote, perform sexually or whatever. There's a lot of fears and insecurities around that. And so we need to recognize in this first year, all of these things are happening. And so there is one thing I'll say this episode, next episode, there is no rush to make this part of your relationship, quote unquote, happen or better, or, however you want to say that. It's going to be very important, I think, to really tap into your body and your safety and your desires. And what I mean by that is like your desire for security and your desire for intimacy in a relationship, and really respect that. And I will say from personal experience, there's a lot of things that, because I kind of I had a goal in my mind sort of when we started this of what I wanted to work towards. And because of that, I think it kept me or reiterated or kept me from doing things, or it reiterated to me that I didn't want to do things. So for example, within that first year, there was a lot of, oh my gosh, I can totally see why someone might want to immediately do like a boob job after betrayal, for example, or different types of body adjustments, or focusing so much on appearance, right? And again, if you do breast augmentation or anything, again, no right or wrong necessarily, but what I'm looking at there is the underlying reason, right? Some people just want to do it for themselves because they want to. If you ever want to make a decision because you are trying to please an addict who hasn't healed his wounds, that is not necessarily the healthiest response, right? And so for me personally, the way I was viewing it, and again, right or wrong, different people might have different perspectives, but for me personally, I really, really, really was wanting to get through this process, as painful as it was, and as many temptations as there were in that first year. I wanted to get through this process where I got back to the place of liking and thinking my own body was good enough. I really wanted to get there. And so I did not want to do anything that over time I would change my mind about. And even within that was this sort of desire to get attention from other men, or to go to bars, or to go to clubs or something and get this validation. And there were certain periods of time in that first year where that was like a really strong desire. I was like, I just want to like leave the house and get some attention. I want to feel validated. I want somebody to tell me I'm pretty. I want somebody to hit on me, and that was so many of my own insecurities coming out through this process. And I knew that if I took action on any of those things and we stayed together and we reconciled, I would only regret it. And so for me, it was really getting clear. And I talk to my clients about this a lot, is getting clear on the vision. Like, what are you working towards? What is the goal here? If you're going to go through this pain, if you're going to go through this recovery, like, what are you trying to work towards? Because when that is super clear, it helps you make these decisions when you're in pain, when you're feeling weak, when you're feeling vulnerable, when you're feeling not pretty, when you're feeling not enough. And the not pretty thing is so real for betrayed partners after betrayal. Like, I've told you this before. I remember when my hair wasn't super long and feminine at that point, because I was like a year and a half out from chemo. And so it had started growing back and had just sort of started looking somewhat feminine again, And so I was incredibly self-conscious as everything was coming out, and I was asking you all these questions. And I had like this thought, I was like, I have to look pretty. Like if I'm mad at you, like my hair has to be just right. Right. Like, and crying makes me look so ugly. And so it's a huge insecurity. So that's a lot to sort of start this episode with. These are a lot of the patterns and a lot of fears and a lot of insecurity. So just imagine having all of this bundled into a bucket and then going, but I have to have sex with my partner today. That is just a lot of pressure to put on yourself when there are all of these fears and insecurities that actually need to be respected. They need to be addressed. They need to be validated and healed and worked through with a professional, coach, therapist, that sort of thing, but also with your partner. These are things that take time to rebuild and to reestablish and to work through. Okay, so let's talk about some of the same fears and things that play into the addict. Do you want to take this?
Sure. I'll go ahead and take that. So, much like on the betrayed side, you can get into a hyper or hyposexual piece. So, maybe once you're discovered, you want to prove to your partner that you only have eyes for them. So you may pursue them pretty aggressively sexually, and for all the reasons that you just talked about, that may
that's happening.
Right.
Yeah.
It may lead to like a period where there could just be a lot of sex going on. And so
Again, not right or wrong.
Right,
We just want to always make sure that we're acknowledging the pain and the wounding and not ignoring that.
Right,
Yeah.
right. And then also, let's say if the addict comes at it from a hypersexual standpoint, but the betrayed is hyposexual, the one thing you got to keep in mind there is, let's say acting out was part of your habit. Well, now all of a sudden that door is closed, right? Let's say there's all kinds of boundaries. You can't get here, you can't get there, and there's a boundary on masturbation and all this stuff. So you're feeling, that's kind of natural. You're going to feel that, like, oh my gosh, this thing that I was doing, I'm no longer doing.
You don't have the outlet per se.
You don't have the outlet per se, right? So you may feel like, and you may even have a nocturnal emission.
Oh, that's a good thing to talk about. Right. And I also want to sort of I think probably if people have gotten to this point in this episode at this part of our podcast, like all the way into the second year, they probably may not be thinking this, but we always want to make it clear, even in marriage, no one has a right to somebody else's body.
Right.
So the consent piece is always going to be huge, and having both partners on the same page about what you're working towards and what you want to do daily, weekly, monthly, as you move through recovery. These boundaries are going to shift and change as you go. And so never ever coming at it from a perspective of, well, we're married and we're still together right now, or I've been sober for 2 weeks or whatever. Right. So I deserve XYZ. Nobody deserves to use someone else for sexual outlet without their consent, ever.
The second one is, or the other part of that, the opposite of that, of course, is the hyposexual piece, where you just shut it all down. You shut the entire thing down for yourself. And I know, in my case, it was what was going through my head was, well, there's been a lot of harm in this. I cannot see at this point how there would be any good to it. So I'll just shut it all down. And I remember, through various moments in that recovery, over the course of probably the first 2 years, you'd be like, why don't you express desire towards me? And I know a lot of that was because I had shut it all down. Mm-hmm. And so it was like, well, of course I'm attracted to you. Of course I would love to have sex with you, but I've shut it down. So there's going to be no, you know what I mean? So
switch has been flipped.
Yeah, right. And the switch, not only has it been flipped, but it's been ripped out of the wall. So we can't even activate it anymore. So that's a pretty common thing, is to say, hey, I'm the source of all of this pain, so I'm just going to shut it down. The next one is, you may fear that not having sex will push you to relapse. However you as a couple define the relapse to be, and that is very much a couple's discussion that needs to be had. Certainly, there's some clear recommendations, like, not looking at pornography, not seeing the affair partner, not masturbating, those kinds of things. But, there is this sense that, oh my gosh, if I don't have sex, I'm going to relapse. Let me reassure you that you don't have to have sex. If you don't get this release, your body will figure it out. You'll either have a nocturnal emission, or it may just get absorbed back into you. There's nothing that is required. Sometimes we feel, what is it, the 72-hour thing?
I mentioned that last episode.
Yeah, that's a 72-hour thing. So it's all bunk. It's not true. Your body will manage itself.
Yeah, the only thing that, when you look at the research that people have done around that to kind of see, like, where in the world did that rule come from? It was something that somebody took out and then sort of manipulated from the research, that was basically like the sperm refills completely or something after 72 hours. But that doesn't mean that you're going to be in pain. It doesn't mean that you have to release it again. There's nothing associated with that at all. And
I think there's like, it's almost like it's all part of how your hormones react. So I think in the first 24 to 36 hours after a man's had sex, his testosterone will drop quite a bit
after an orgasm.
Right, after an orgasm. So it's all part of the process.
That science has now said, like, hey, if you're aroused and you don't orgasm, and you actually don't orgasm for a long period of time, your testosterone increases. So there's actually imagine that benefit from having self-control sometimes, so yeah, there's benefits to both, right? There's chemical benefits to having an orgasm that people enjoy, and it bonds you to your partner when you're connecting with your partner. And there's benefits to having self-control and not orgasming, and you have hormone boosts from that and stuff like that. And so yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I think they may view just the total act of sex as being a complete shame-filled thing, and any sort of discussion about it, any sort of because let's say you're like in our case, you tie it to your identity. It was very much my identity. So we go from you asking me all kinds of questions about what my addiction was and what my behavior was. And it's also shame inducing, and it's huge, and it builds heaps of shame on me. You weren't building heaps of shame. I was building heaps of shame. And then, hey, let's cuddle or whatever. And it's like, it's so hard to make that differentiation, and that's part of the healing work that has to happen. So I think for the addict's going to feel that the addict is really going to, the addict that's truly wanting to recover and demonstrating empathy and really trying to learn more about it, is going to feel this deep, like, blob of shame over it all. It's not going to be clear. You're not going to be able to silo it. You're not going to be able to do any of that.
So I think on the addict side, if you are feeling super hypersexual as you're getting into recovery, the work there a lot of the times is going to be learning, and this is like addiction recovery in general, it's learning to humanize the partner, right? It's learning to value and humanize and put, again, rising above the physicality of it and learning how to bring the intimacy in. For the hypo, it's going to be dealing with a lot of and processing the guilt and shame and learning how to love and value yourself again, even after the bad things that have happened.
Right. Right. And then I think the final thing is, the addict may be afraid that if they open the door again to some sexuality, which could be a healthy sexuality, like in the context of the relationship, that it could lead to triggers. And so there's a lot of fear that, hey, if I go through this process, what's going to flash through my head? Sometimes people get intrusive thoughts, and sometimes people get all these different things. So if you start this process of starting to be intimate again, are you going to have flashbacks? Are you going to have all of these different things? And so I think the answer to that is, well, you might, and that's just part of your mind moving through it, but be open and honest about it. Be able to talk to those things, be able to talk to your therapist about those things.
Well, and your spouse too, because I have a lot of empathy for addicts going through recovery that, like, I would say you have the most quote unquote neurotypical brain of like anyone I know, honestly. Like a lot of my friends have a lot of similar brain patterns to me, and we either have ADD or OCD or PTSD or whatever it is. And so we're just, we got a lot going on up here. And so you have a very quiet brain, which people that have quiet brains, I feel like that is and I actually have mentioned, I want to do a whole episode on this, but I think that they have it's a real boon to recovery. It's an amazing gift to have that. People that on either side have something like OCD, where they might have intrusive thoughts, and they it can really complicate the process, or I would say maybe not complicate, it can bring more fear into it, right? Kind of exactly what you were just saying. Well, what if a thought pops in, right? And I have that. So that has been something where we have to talk about that. And within this relation, or this context of talking about sex, as you go through recovery, we hope that this is becoming more and more common for you to have deeper and more uncomfortable and more vulnerable conversations with each other until the point where they are no longer uncomfortable. And so basically, if this is happening, don't push through it. If you are like, oh, I just had an intrusive thought, oh, but I can't tell my partner this, and oh, but that makes me so uncomfortable. And then you are physically engaging in the act of sex while having these cascades of shame or guilt or fear flooding your system. You don't want to mix all of that up in your body. So just pause. That's what we've done. We just pause and I go, hey, I'm having an intrusive thought right now. And then you offer compassion, you offer space. Sometimes it's like, okay, I'm good. Like, it's fine. And then other times it's like, you know what? I think maybe we should stop.
Mhm.
Right. And so that it's okay. It's always okay to have those conversations. And I think the more you have those conversations, the more you learn about your partner, the closer you get. And so it definitely a good thing to sort of bring that up for sure. Okay, so we talked about underneath sort of the fears and insecurities of the betrayed partner. A lot of those, I'm sure I didn't cover them all. I know that there's so much wrapped up in sexuality, just in humanity in general, but definitely after discovery. And then for the addict as well, there's a lot of shame, there's a lot of fear, there's a lot of guilt, there's a lot of associating negative emotions with sexual behaviors in general. And so with that as an understanding, what the heck is your sexual life going to look like with your partner in the first year of recovery? And so we have a couple points here that we just sort of want to talk about as we go along. So I think what we should understand is that these fears and these insecurities and these beliefs, usually a lot of these are coming from normal needs and desires that people have when they're in a relationship with someone else, right? And so the first one is that both of you are asking for full faithfulness and fidelity, right? I want the eyes and the desire of my partner to be focused only on me. Both of you are going to want that through this process. The second desire or need that you're going to have is that you want your partner to feel like they sexually desire you. And you are going to want to desire your partner. Now, there might be phases throughout this process where you feel more or less attracted to your partner as you're going through these things. And that's okay. Again, I will never encourage someone to engage in a sexual act that they are not fully consenting to and wanting to and participating in through this process or ever. But especially as you're rebuilding, it's going to become more and more and more important that both of you reestablish bodily autonomy through this and communicate through the process, because we want it to be the safest relationship and the safest sexual experiences that you've ever had in your life after this. Okay. And the third thing is, I also want to feel seen, respected, and valued. Okay. So that's kind of what I'm talking about there. When you know that you can share with your partner, I'm feeling insecure right now, or I had an intrusive thought, or, this is physically uncomfortable and I think maybe today's not the day, or I'm just not into it today, or whatever it is from both sides, right? You want to feel seen, respected, and valued enough and safe enough to be able to share all of those things. And if you are both totally gung-ho and all of a sudden in the middle of it, you get triggered and you start crying, you always want to feel safe to stop, first of all, and safe enough that your partner allows you to express those emotions as well. And I think there can be, in this first year, a lot of emotions on both sides. I know for me, there was a lot of just a lot of trauma processing in this area, and a lot of releasing pain and releasing energy. And it was such a scary thing as we continued to move through this process that every time I feel like we kept going, it's like I released more trauma and I would cry. And there were times where you would be so overwhelmed that we've worked so hard to overcome XYZ. And then it was, we're feeling the connection and feeling overwhelmed and thinking about where we've come from. And you would cry and release some. And also, I think you also had a lot of fear I think you mentioned it in the last section, but the idea of, well, gosh, I'm like almost 50 dealing with this addiction. I really have a negative association with sex
Right.
in a huge way up to this point. How do I rewire that to the point where it's healthy and while also respecting my wife's boundaries that are at the time, in that first year were really, really high for me.
Yeah. Yeah. I actually, I just remember being like, I can't believe, to your point, I can't believe I'm 50, I was 49 when I was discovered, and, decades of bad patterns and being hurt myself and all of these different things. So in my mind, and I remember saying this, well, if we don't make it, I'm not going to be with anybody again, because that's an easy thing, right? That's a thing that says in my head, like, because then you just
Shut it down.
live single the rest of your life, and you are not, you just,
No temptation.
no temptation, no nothing, because it's easy, because this other process, healing is painful.
Healing is painful.
And so that's a big part of that.
So getting into some of the more practical, we've talked about the feelings, we've talked about what you actually want, what people are moving towards, right? We're moving towards connection, safety, respect, value, bodily autonomy, consent, those sorts of things. So within that, what are some practical things that you might expect within this first year? Well, the first one is a 90 days of celibacy. So we talked about this we have a whole episode on this. I think it's in maybe episode 3 or 4, right in the first season. So if you haven't checked that out and you're really early in this phase, please do go check that out. But we're going to hit a few bullet points here about this. This is going to do a few really important things. It's going to prove to the addict that they do have self-control. It's going to prove to the betrayed partner that their boundaries can be respected. Although I will say sometimes betrayed partners have a hard time with this too, right? So we'll talk about that in just a second. But it's like, hey, how come I have to go through celibacy? This is your problem, right? And so that kind of feels unfair sometimes. So sometimes the 90 days can feel like a relief to the betrayed partner. Hey, this is off the table. Other times it can feel like a burden to the betrayed partner. And so that's going to be an important conversation to have, because the betrayed partner has not and does not need to commit to 90 days of celibacy. The addict, though, it's very important for a couple reasons. One, it proves that they can accomplish it. It proves that sex is not in control of them. They are in control of sex. And with the negative patterning that addiction has had in their brain and in their body, it's going to be very important for them to essentially master the beast, or however you want to word that, of basically being like, no, reiterating in their own mind and their own body, I am in control of this, in 100% control. I can be aroused and do absolutely nothing about it. I can be turned on by my wife and do absolutely nothing about it. I don't have to masturbate every day. I don't have to look anything. I don't have to actually have intercourse. I don't have to do anything sexual at all. I'm in control of this. And the thing with 90 days is that that is generally 60 to 90 days is generally the accepted amount of time that it takes the chemical processes to rebalance essentially in the body. So with addiction, there's a lot of brain chemicals at play. And so giving the body time to repattern and sort of let those patterns die out, about 60 to 90 days is typically what is recognized there as kind of allowing that to die out. And you can just view it like any other addiction. There's a withdrawal process that's really important in order for you to be able to live a healthy life and to break the cord or connection of power that thing has over you. And it's the exact same thing with sex addiction. And so you want to go through the withdrawal process, and and just to be aware, like that's going to be different for different people. For you, it was a lot of feelings of emptiness. Sometimes there's more hormone and mood shifts there. Sometimes there will be anger or frustration, or just like these feelings of unease that they can go through. Because again, I think the understanding of it here is really important to kind of help you move through this. Again, there is this chemical shift happening in the body. And so you may not even want to act out at all, but you have certain sort of cravings. And so taking this time to really go inward and go, where are these coming from? What is the desire underneath that? What is the feeling or the emotional want that I have that is being brought to the surface here? This can be a super great period of time for the addict to begin becoming self-aware for the first time in their life and begin kind of journaling and thinking through, like, what are these feelings that I'm having as the chemicals are still present in my body and getting less every day. So it's a great opportunity for them. And then again, for the betrayed partner, understanding, hey, I'm allowed to set boundaries here. But also, if you're feeling like, hey, I'm really not okay with 90 days to celibacy, and I think we talk about this in that previous episode, but there are a lot of different options. Like, it's not 0 to intercourse. Like, there's so many things in between. The addict himself does not need to engage in sexual behavior in order to participate in something that maybe his wife is interested in.
Yeah, and I think too, the one thing to keep in mind is at the end of 90 days, it's not like a honeymoon. I mean, don't expect that. Don't expect like you just came back from overseas or whatever, and or whatever, and you see your wife for the first time in 90 days, and like it could very well turn into 120 days, 150 days. Like it could just but it's just what you're trying to do is you're trying to build this like I would encourage the addict not to put pressure on the betrayed spouse at the end of 90 days and be like, hey, I went 90 days. Like, this is all about teaching you to be a new person. And in some addicts' lives, it could be the first time since puberty that they have gone longer than 90 days. And so I think it's, this is about reclaiming your freedom, reclaiming your control, and reclaiming your ability to live as a normal, regulated human being. So don't expect that in day 91 that, all your sexual problems are going to be fixed. Don't expect any of that. Like like I said, it could continue. Those days could continue.
Well, and it's also about, like you were saying, like disconnecting from this idea that like, well, it's just something I have to do or something that I need, and learning during that 90 days and beyond, how do I actually reconnect with my partner? And same thing for the betrayed partner. So again, not necessarily any right or wrong if you want to or don't want to have sex after the 90 days immediately. And let's get specific, intercourse after the 90 days. I think it's always important to ask yourself, why do you want it? Right? What is the underlying desire? If you're feeling super connected and safe with your partner and you want to do something that expresses that, you want to get closer to them and you're proud of them and you're feeling really happy in the relationship, that's one thing. If you are wanting to have intercourse because it feels like if you don't, something bad will happen, then just, learn how to question what those motivations are, so that if you are having an emotional need or an emotional fear, right? Like, I want to feel connected. How can we first meet that in a really healthy way? Are there ways other than intercourse that you can begin developing this connection with your partner? And then the physical stuff is an expression of that. And again, we're going to talk more about intimacy and that part of it in our next episode. So stay tuned. But I think that's going to be really important. So the first recommendation is 90 days. There are so many benefits, so many benefits to both partners to go through this once you've found out that addiction is the problem. And so talking with your coach, practitioner, therapist, your group, whoever you're working with, to sort of guide you through this and give you the tools that you need can be really, really, really important. The second thing to kind of help you through the first year is, and we're going to talk about this over and over and over, probably about the same amount as we talk about safety, deep conversations. I mean, about everything. If there's a conversation that you feel uncomfortable having, which after betrayal and discovery and disclosure, there are a lot of topics that are off, or not off the table, but feel uncomfortable, right? When I was sitting in that bedroom the first 3 days asking a million questions, I could barely get the word masturbation out of my mouth without just feeling like blushing and feeling just ugh, like, this is so, like, I can't believe that I am saying these words and asking these questions and learning about this topic and all this kind of stuff. And here I am having a podcast talking to everyone. And, I talk to my clients about this stuff all the time. And, it's been a real healing process, right? But in order to get to that place where it's not scary, where there's not shame involved, where it's not something that you have to avoid and walk on eggshells about, you've got to rip the Band-Aid off and talk about it. And who should you feel safer with than your partner who's working with you towards reconciliation? And ultimately, both of you are individuals who want to feel seen and loved and respected and valued. And if you feel like there's something you can't talk about, those are the things to talk about. And so as you go through recovery and you're talking about sex in this first year, there are a lot of uncomfortable conversations around sex. And I always encourage people to get specific because, again, sometimes I think we have this idea that it's like zero to intercourse, right? It's not. There's so much in between. One of the primary conversations that ends up being had often after discovering that there's an addiction involved is, well, what about masturbation? Like, how do you guys feel about masturbation for the addict? Is that on the table? Is it off the table? Does it matter if he fantasizes? Some men do, some men don't. Obviously, you don't want him to be looking at his addict material, whether that's porn or cybersex or whatever, right? But some men have images in their head that they just pull up when they masturbate. Other men don't. Does it bother you if he masturbates if he doesn't have the images? If it does bother you and you want it to be completely off the table because you feel like it's too close to the addiction itself, that's okay. But that's a conversation that needs to be had. What do you feel about masturbation for the betrayed partner? Some people in conservative Christian communities might view that as bad. Other people might view it as completely normal because she hasn't done anything wrong. Maybe she doesn't fantasize, she doesn't look at porn or whatever. And in some cases, it can even be beneficial to help her reconnect to her body and process some trauma and work on sexual healing and reclaiming her sexuality and reclaiming her body as you two are working together as a couple to reclaim sexuality as a couple as well. And so getting very specific about, well, what does this mean, right? We had totally different boundaries around it before I discovered that there was an addiction involved than we did afterwards, for sure. And then the other piece to that conversation is, well, what about together, right? So we were just talking about 90 days, right? Like, is there a situation during the 90 days where the two of you are together and you are working on the betrayed partner, but the addict is not being sexually touched, right? And so do you guys engage in that together during the 90 days? Do you engage in it together after the 90 days? How do you feel about him touching his own penis? Like, is that okay for you? Or is that really triggering around his actual behavior? There's so much in there. Does it bother you if he looks at certain parts of your body because he had certain patterns in his addiction? Now, over time, we want to work on healing a lot of this, right? But in the moment, it's going to be important to understand the patterns and understand, what do I feel comfortable with? What do I not feel comfortable with? What does he feel comfortable with? What does he not feel comfortable with? What does he feel like might be triggering in a sexual act? What do you feel might be triggering in a sexual act? And that's going to be really, really important. And so having conversations around all types of sexual behaviors, anything you've had in the past in your marriage, anything you want to have in the future, anything you're currently having or not having or want to have or don't want to have, all of that is going to be really important to start talking about and having these conversations over so you're on the same page and there's no guessing about like what I feel comfortable with or not.
I think too, what you may find during the early stages is you may hear the betrayed partner or even the addicted say, "I will never do this. I will never do that." And that's okay. That actually comes from a point of deep kind of traumatic wounding or whatever. But just keep in mind what you may find also is as you move into healing, that what was a never becomes somewhat more of a, oh, okay, I feel better now. I feel respected. I feel loved. I feel safe. And what was a never might be a maybe now or something like that, as far as something in the bedroom. And so,
at that point, I think I would say too, the addict should be very careful. How do I say this? Be really careful as you're going through this. Again, sort of coming back to you don't want to just step in and become the porn, right?
Right.
There's healthy sexual interaction, there's unhealthy sexual interaction. And as you're going through this, you want to make sure that it's all healthy. It's human focused first, sexual act focused underneath of that. Mm-hmm. So your human focus has to do with expressing empathy, creating safety, connecting with your partner, wanting to make sure they are in the moment and feeling good about everything. And then the sexual act and kind of what you guys are doing falls within that. But if you're leading with the sexual act, well, I really want to get to oral. I really want to get to this. I really want to get to that. Those might be goals, but the way you're wording them, or you never want it to come across as a demand or an expectation after this, or any sort of pressure. It always wants to be, a mutual conversation between the two of you about what is still triggering, what is safe, what is not safe.
Yeah, yeah. I think it's like they always say, it's okay for you to express what you want. It's also okay for that person to say, I'm not comfortable doing that.
Right.
On both sides. And so
well, and if that is said, not then again pressuring them of like, well, again, I've been sober for like 6 months. Why aren't you ready to do that?
Yeah. Yeah. And so, I think
there's a lot of reasons they might not be ready.
Yeah. And also too, you're like, if the addict doesn't appear to be in any sort of healing and keeps requesting a specific sexual act, it's okay for the betrayed partner to say, hold on, I'm very uncomfortable with how you're expressing this. I don't know whether you have a pornified view of things versus, are we starting to let our guard down? Are we starting to heal? And so I think it's okay to kind of listen to the instinctual part, or the gut feeling, or the gut read of the other person when saying those things. Yeah.
And I think a lot of this, again, we've talked about sort of, I don't want to call it like the power dynamic, but just the relational dynamic shifts after discovery. And then it sort of balances out as recovery is, becomes more grounded and long-term. And then the relationship sort of equalizes again. So the same thing sort of happens in the sexual relationship. The betrayed partner is usually more frequently sort of quote unquote calling the shots for quite a while because of the damage, because of the trauma, because of the boundaries and the fears and the insecurities that they now have to work through. And so you just don't want to rush that process. Now, some people have a trauma bucket that's much deeper than other people, and that's okay. Again, timeline wise, there's not necessarily a right or wrong. So if you're on the slower end of the spectrum, stay tuned, because next week you're going to find out that I was too. But if you're on the faster end of the spectrum, that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. Just make sure on both sides that you are feeling totally aligned with that. There's nothing in your nervous system that you're overriding, suppressing, or denying in order to accomplish this thing that you think you need to accomplish on a certain timeline. The timeline does not exist. The connection is your guide to when this is the right moment for you. And the level of your conversations and your safety around this topic. And this is an opportunity. This is so interesting about this, is recovery provides you this opportunity to have a vulnerable and intimate relationship, and the level of conversations that you have after this that you may never have had you not gone through this thing, for sure. Okay, so we have 90 days of celibacy, having deep conversations, understanding what are relapses versus triggers. I talk to my clients a lot about that. Get super clear on definitions, like more detailed than you think you need to get on what a relapse or what a slip is. And if you need support with that, and you're a betrayed partner, book a call with me. I help people set boundaries and kind of work through these definitions based on your individual situation. But it's really important, because if you go too broad, then a lot of different things will come up that become unclear.
Yeah, it's interesting that sometimes people will say, well, my wife wants to know if I have dreams. And so and that's okay. I mean, if you all decide that, that's what you're going to share, some wives may say, I don't know what you dream. But I think, as you move through each thing, it's like, you can't control what you dream, right? You dream what you dream. Do you want to know what comes into your mind? Do you want to know, there's just so much that can go into that. What is a trigger and what's a relapse, and all of that. And it does take time. It does take definition, and it does take.
Well, I think sometimes
because it shifts too.
Yeah. And I think that's sometimes why it is nice to talk to a coach or a practitioner or a therapist and stuff, to kind of find out, like, something, what's normal, what's common. But your situation is always a little bit different than everybody else's too. And so just kind of working through some of those thoughts and kind of getting those definitions super, super clear. So the third thing that can come to play as we're talking about sex after betrayal and recovery is understanding the addict's patterns. So I was sort of mentioning this a little bit earlier, but what might be off the table sexually that was on the table before, because it parallels his addiction too closely, or it's triggering to the betrayed partner because of some of the things she found out. That's going to be really important to understand. And you may not know the answer to that unless you know and have gone through the full therapeutic disclosure and sort of know what the patterns and the behaviors and the frequency and things like that were. But I mentioned that like with masturbation, for example, that's usually like primary association. And so how do you feel about that? What's off the table because it triggers the spouse, right? Like either direction. So it may not be related to the addiction at all, but now because of modesty boundaries or insecurities or different boundaries that they have or lack of safety, they might not be willing to do some of the things that they've done before, right? Are there specific words? Maybe you guys had sexy talk to each other before and you don't like that anymore because you found out that they use certain words or terminology with whoever or whatever. And are there specific behaviors or phrases or words that you want to take off the table for now? Right. So the idea with all of this isn't to turn it into something that's scary or fearful. It's to create a space where you can begin reconnecting with total safety. You both understand the other person's psyche and where you're at, and you're providing this really, really safe place to start reconnecting. And then two really small, not small, but they're going to be short points for us to kind of hit here is consider what type of protection you might want to use. So, lots of different things out there. You can have birth control or an IUD, and some people choose to do that and they feel really comfortable with it and good about that. Other people don't want to have, birth control pills or an IUD or anything. And sometimes their bodies or their hormones or their emotions don't respond well to those things. And so there's always, and this is, some people do, like, they're like, yeah, this is totally normal for us. And other people are like, oh my gosh, I can't believe people do that. And it's the pull out method. And so, that does involve communication and self-control and that sort of thing. And it's not, 100% guaranteed, that sort of thing. Right. But it is an option. And so that's definitely something to consider and talk about. Condoms, all of these types of things, but talk about that. Make sure that you guys are clear about that. If you, make sure you understand what days of the month, like, do you track your hormonal cycle? You're only fertile about 6 days of the month. That's 5 days before ovulation and then the day you ovulate. So if you're tracking your cycle, you'll know which days, if you have ejaculation inside of you, it is likely to get taken up and fertilized. And if you know exactly when you ovulate, when, after period, it might be safe. And so again, kind of researching that, understanding what are the risks, what's the safety here? What's the likelihood of not getting pregnant here? And then what do I feel safest doing? And maybe you want to combine those, right? Like maybe you want to pull out and track your cycle. And so you're doing both, even though certain days you don't think you're fertile, but you're being extra careful, right? Or you're pairing it with, a different thing. And so just, there's lots of different options there, but it's something I feel like, you should talk about, because what if you are going through this and you're really not ready to get pregnant and you get pregnant? Is that something that you have talked about at this point? And so just really being careful about what page of sexuality are you guys on, and making sure it's the same page. Again, not necessarily a right or wrong, but making sure these are the types of conversation you have after all this has come out. Really, really important. And then the last thing we're going to talk about, we've sort of touched on it several times, but it really is important. It really, really is, especially when there's been such pain associated, such negative connotations, such lack of health, and such an objectification aspect towards sexuality and using people or objects for sexual pleasure, is consent. And so consent is going to be really important, that you have two people that are not just barely willing, but want to be engaged in sexual activities when you choose to do it, how you choose to do it, and that you always feel like stopping is always an option. You can always say, I'm not ready. I don't feel good. I've changed my mind. I thought I wanted to do this, but I don't want to do this. And creating a space between the two of you that feels completely safe at any moment to say, I'd really like to connect with you in this way, specifically this way, and not in this way. Or I thought I was ready to do this, but a lot's coming up for me right now, and I'm not okay with it. Mm-hmm. All of that is okay. So communication, vulnerability. Those are the pieces that are going to lead you into a safe place with sexuality as you continue to recover.
Yeah, I think you may experience a lot of start and stop. start and stop, start and then not try again for 7, 10, 14 days. Like all of that's okay. And that's just part and parcel of this whole process as you're trying to reestablish, because there's just a lot of hurt and tough feelings around this. So I've heard people say, well, maybe I don't know if I could stop or whatever. Like, sure you can. You're especially for the addict, you are a much stronger person than maybe you ever exhibited before. And it's amazing the strength that you have. Mm-hmm. And so
and that goes into, I think, reminding yourself of the humanity of the other person, mm-hmm. right? It's not all about physical, quote unquote, satisfaction or orgasm or whatever. It's about connecting with another human being. Mm-hmm. And so when you bring it right up into your consciousness that this is a connection piece, and I think that makes it easier to stop if you go, oh, they're in pain, or, oh, they're not connected right now, or, oh, they're not feeling safe, mm-hmm. right? And so bringing that into the forefront of all of your thoughts and all of your conversation, then it's a totally different physical experience.
You can get, I think one of the things the words they talk about is attunement. And so when you're attuned to others, you can really pay attention to what they're feeling and they're needing, and you can hold space for them, mm-hmm. Even when you're maybe, counter to what you grew up knowing, which is, hey, at that point, it's about you or whatever. It really doesn't have to be. And so as you move into health, you're going to experience more and more of that.
All right. Ooh, this is a good topic. It's a tough topic to talk about. There's a lot of T's, tough topic to talk about. Hopefully we did it justice. I know that in one episode, we can't answer all of the questions. So we are going to go into more on this next week, talking about actually reestablishing true intimacy with sex, which we've sort of hinted at the past couple episodes. So stay tuned. We're going to talk about vulnerable. We're going to talk really much more detail about our own process, kind of navigating that, and the processes that we took step by step to sort of get there. And so we hope that this is helpful. We hope this, maybe listening to this episode together, has brought up some important conversations to have, and that it has sparked some new talks and some new connection between the two of you as you continue to move through recovery. And if this episode or this podcast has been helpful, please just take 2 moments to leave a review and or share it with someone you think might benefit from this. We know that addiction and betrayal and unhealthy sexual behaviors are just rampant in our culture and in our society. So maybe this is a podcast that you want to share with some friends or some family, or maybe it's a podcast that you feel comfortable sharing with the pastor at your church to kind of just bring awareness to this type of topic. And if you feel like that's appropriate, we would absolutely love to hear about that. So thank you for being here today, and we will see you next week.
Woohoo! If you're listening to this, it means you've made it through an entire episode. Part of recovery is spending time engaging in healing and self-growth activities. We are thankful that you chose our podcast to be one of those activities today. Make sure you reward yourself for that accomplishment. If you've enjoyed this episode or this podcast, we would love to hear from you. Please take just a few moments to leave a rating and review, letting us know your experience with Recover You. We not only love hearing how these episodes are helpful, but ratings and reviews help others just like you who are searching for recovery information and support find the podcast too. We can't wait to hear from you. See you next week.